How's it going, everyone? So for those of y'all who missed the stream, we're just building a project in public where all of it, like, yeah, all of it will be streamed. Just to share some tips, some background, and I guess one benefit was I forgot to enable the setting on Twitch that like records your streams because they're probably going to be about 2 hours each. So instead, I'm just going to go over this, which will be a little bit denser, and just try to focus more on design choices and then just tips if you're a builder. If you have like absolutely zero coding experience, this might be a little bit tougher for you because a little bit is more like for people who have a bit of a coding background. But if you're like beginner to intermediate and you're mostly vibe coding, but you also have like some minor software background, I think this is perfect. And then if you're very advanced, a lot of the stuff you'll probably already be familiar with. You'll probably know more. So if that's you, then do feel free to share any tips you have in the comment section down below. But yeah, the goals of today is we didn't make a ton of progress because just a 2 hour stream. I was pretty much just trying to pull data, but just what the project is, some building tips. I have a list over here on the right that I'm going to go through. A bit about setting up the project, why we're starting with the data instead of the web app, and then some of the progress we made on that, and then how to organize a project in a way that's more friendly for agents and LLMs, but also for people, but most importantly for agents and LLMs, because that's what's going to be working on the code for the most part. So the project's name is GovStalker. Kind of going off the inspiration, you can see it at the top. The Epstein file stuff, the overview where you can kind of like track people. I thought you could do something similar for Congress since there's a lot of frustration on the outsized influence that lobbying has, where like, you know, if if running ads makes it very easy to sway public opinion, then people who have money to run ads can sway public opinion. Versus if you make it extremely easy to see how a politician acts, how they voted, and where their money's coming from, then the goal is that people as voters can make better decisions in alignment with their interests or things they care about. So that's the gist. That's beside the most important part is the technical stuff. That's what we're here for today. So to start off, building the project, there's really two main parts: the data and the web app. So it's just going to be a web app that'll have, I guess, things like what state you're from. We'll just try to make it as easy as possible for people who are voters to see politicians that are of interest to them. Ideally, this will be out and have good traction by the midterm, so it can help with that as well. But for this type of project, right, you're going to have Claude Code one-shot your web app, but you need to tell it what type of data you'll have. So the first thing I wanted to work on in the stream, thinking through that, was like, okay, how do we pull the information on where they're getting their money from, and how do we pull information on how they voted in the past? This would probably only be easiest to do at the federal level to start, but eventually you can add things like state level and maybe more advanced things like what they've been saying on their campaign and how that's aligned with how they voted in the past. Because like, if some politicians will change how they vote, but they'll always be honest about it. But some will say one thing and do another, and that's really what is more concerning. But anyways, so for setting up the project, I just had two folders: web app and data, because those are the two parts. There's nothing in the web app right now; it's just a placeholder. For data, first thing I did was make a venv. If you're using Python, which I would generally recommend for any backend stuff, you're going to have a bunch of packages you'll install, and it's just nice to have those be managed for each project on its own. So you can tell any LLM how to do this, but you just it's a virtual environment that just like, yeah, when you install packages, it only gets installed to that environment, and then you can just enable that environment every time you run that project. So it just makes it easier to not have things like your wires get crossed, and if there's different package versions that you're using for different projects because you set them up at different times, it's just a whole mess. So use a VM. There's other options for package management. Talk to your local LLM about it when you're setting up your project. Poetry is a really popular one, but I like VN because it works for me. And if it's not, I'm sure there's some optimization that can be done with some other one, but it's simple, it works, it's good enough. And yeah, why start with data? First off, like when you're starting a project with just an idea, you don't fully know what's possible, right? Like what I'm going to be able to do is going to be constrained by what information I have. So it's good to have clarity on what your goal is. Yeah, if you're building a project, it's going to be constrained by what data you have, right? So if there's no way to pull information on a specific thing, even if I want that, it doesn't make sense to build a web app that shows that if I can't do it yet. So first I need to know what I can do, and that is going to be set by the data. So first I asked Claude, I was like, hey, I want to see where financing comes from because that information is public. It gave me this website, so I just went to their website. Let me see here, boom, boom. I think, yeah, it already rerouted here. Yeah, and you just get an API key. I filled this out, first name, last name. Most of what setup is just getting API keys from different services that you're gonna need. And it has like, I think they have better, I swear they had another page with their documentation. No? I swear they did. Maybe it was just this. Oh yeah. Okay, I opened these, yeah. So if you have a page like this, right, the immediate thing you want to know is like, are LLMs familiar with this? Is Claude Code familiar with this? Oh, by the way, yeah, I'm using Claude Code as the extension in Visual Studio Code. That's my setup. I never told you what my setup was. I like this compared to the terminal just because like being able to click and see the comparisons is a little bit more friendly than running it in terminal. But if you're a terminal Claude Code user and you like that, then keep doing that. Whatever you like is perfect. But yeah, for APIs, like if it's something super common, like the OpenAI API, like most LLMs are going to know that, and you're not going to have to give them context. For this one, I just copy pasted this entire page. Like I expanded all these and was like, hey, here's the information. Pretty much told it what I was doing. I was like, hey, make a service that can pull most of the information I want. And the structure of the data folder, this one's a little bit confusing. It's pretty much a cache, but we'll get to that later, having data within data. But the main thing is services, right? If you're going to be doing things, and there's different things you're going to be doing, and you just want a folder for each thing that you do. It's pretty much that simple. So at some point, we'll be processing stuff with LLMs. It will need a folder for LLMs. But for now, it's just pulling financial data for the campaigns, and that we just have. This is essentially a wrapper around the FEC stuff. A wrapper, if you're not familiar, pretty much just means like it does all the requests and formatting. So it's not really doing any like more advanced logic, but it's just kind of our code's way of interfacing with the information that they make available. The other thing that's really big is you will almost always want models. These are like classes that define how your data is structured. The reason why this is really nice, right, especially if you're going to be doing things over multiple sessions, right? So your LLM or agent will not always have context on what fields are in each piece of information. So this is like a way where it can immediately find that. So let's say later down the road, I've pulled all this financial data and I'm like, hey, I want to give this to an LLM to overview and to give me a summary on, what type of funders are giving money to this individual, yada, 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 right? It needs to know how the information is structured in order to give that to the LLM. So having this be like clearly defined makes it way easier, because then this can go be like, okay, let me see the service for campaign finances. Oh, cool, there's a models folder, models file. And again, this was all AI generated. You just tell Claude Code this when you're building, just going over concepts. So at first it was doing dictionaries, which is just like a generic, it can be any structure. It'll just have like key value pairs, but those aren't well defined, right? These will always like have to have these fields in it, and it can define them and things like that. So I guess technically not always, because some of them are optional, but you get the point. It's like, it's structured in a way, and it will always be structured that way, and then the LLM can use that when it's writing code in the future, which is very useful. The other thing for services is it's nice to have each one have its own folder, because again, in the future, if I'm like, hey, I want the LLMs to only be looking at the finances versus how they voted in the past, the Congress folders, or how they voted in the past, like bills and things like that, then it immediately knows. It's very easy for it to find what it needs to get context on, right? So if it goes to campaign finance and it just loads these two files, it doesn't need to load anything else, right? Versus if maybe I have one big folder that loads all the data across all the APIs, and it loads my campaign finances data, and it loads my how they voted in the past data. If that's mixed together, then I'm going to have to load all of that into context every single time, and that's just going to be overhead for the LLM. It's going to make it worse because you want to keep your context as small as possible, but not any smaller. So that is a bit about the services design. Next up, the big thing was for this folder called data. It needs to be structured a little bit better, but essentially we are calling. So the way I was developing this is I would just say, hey, pull this information and then kind of display it to me in a nice way. But we're calling the same data over and over and over again, right? So I just ran this with 3 example candidates. I was like, come up with 3 candidates. I think I picked like Nancy Pelosi, AOC, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then it would pull their information from funding, and I was just like, show me who the top fundraisers are, right? Because I want to validate that it's actually working, it's actually pulling information, and then more importantly, see what that information looks like so I know what I can do with it. But as I'm developing that, right, I'm going to make a little change. I'm going to say, hey, I want you, okay, for example, it wouldn't combine donations from the same donor's name, right? So if I give $10,000 to AOC 5 different times, that will show up as me giving $10,000 5 times. But I'm like, hey, what I really care about is that I've given $50,000 total, right? So combine those, right? And if I tell the LLM that, it's going to have to make an update and I'm going to have to rerun it. And if it's taking time to pull all this information every single time I make a tiny update, that's going to chew up my time super quickly, right? Like let's say it takes 5 minutes to pull all the fundraising data for these 3 candidates. It makes way more sense if I just pull it once locally and save that, right? So a way you can do that is by caching. I put that in the data folder. The first one, it didn't give it its own folder. You should have a folder for each cache, so like for bills that they co-sponsored, for how they voted in the past. The voting stuff is still in progress. But the first one, it was using underscores, so it's not as nice. I have to go back and clean that up. But yeah, you do want like it to be very well organized in folders to keep things clean. But for example, this is there's like different committees, and then those committees put money into campaigns. I don't fully understand the hierarchy of it, which is part of why I was developing it for some time. But this just has information on just things that it will need to use in order to make that picture of how they're being fundraised. So just having this pulled once and then saving it makes it way faster. So especially if you're doing stuff with LLMs, if you're asking them the same question, but then changing how you're interpreting it or analyzing that information, save it once. It'll save you money, save you time. Time is by far the most important of the two, especially if you're developing. So yeah, do try to cache stuff if it's applicable. Obviously, if you're doing something with users that's live, that doesn't make sense to cache that, right? Like if I'm making a chat bot and a person asks a question, like they're going to be asking a different question each time. I shouldn't be saving results. But if it's something where I'm pulling data and then doing something with that data, if I'm changing what I'm doing with that data, me having pulled it doesn't need to be changed. So I can do that once and save it. Makes it way faster. And the concept, yeah, the broader concept that touches on is cycle time, which is one of the most valuable things my mentor at Amazon taught me. But being aware of essentially how you do stuff is like you'll do a thing, you'll run the thing, you'll see what needs to be fixed, and you'll do the thing again. And you just keep doing that. So generally, if you can shrink the time of that cycle or your cycle time, you'll be able to do a lot more stuff. And just being aware of that process will let you see ways that you can shrink that time and do more stuff in the same amount of time. So yeah, that was the cache, and we went over organizing the files. The cache stuff, yeah, so we have services for things like campaign finances in Congress, right? Because those are like kind of individual sub-features, but for something that's going to be used inside of all of those services, a util is a nice thing to do. So the cache utility, right? Because if I'm pulling how they voted in the past, or if I'm pulling who's given the money, I'm going to be caching that either way. So I can just make a single utility, and then both of them can use that utility. Generally, like a good rule of thumb for knowing when you'll do something like this is if it isn't dependent on external code. That's a big one, because like the campaign finances at Congress is dependent on this API, and there's another one for how they voted in the past. This is purely internal. That's generally a green flag that like, well, I guess not a green flag, but a criteria that you would want to be met for something to be saved in a utility. It doesn't always have to be the case, but generally you want that. And then also if it's something that will be used across many different services, that's also useful. And another thing is dependencies, right? Because in Python, you don't want to have this thing called a circular dependency. So let's say my cache needs to use, for whatever reason, needs to use the campaign finances API, but that needs to use the Congress API, which needs to use the cache, right? So if I have A needs B, B needs C, and C needs A, then I have this loop of like they're all depending on each other. That's not good. Generally for utils, you don't want them to be dependent on other things. Like you want other things to depend on them. And that could have been worded better, but like this is just utility code that doesn't use any APIs, doesn't use any stuff, but a lot of different things will get value from using it. So that, I hope conceptually that makes sense. I didn't explain that well at all. Gets put into utils. And yeah, that's all the stuff we've got. Well, I guess the last thing is script. So this is where I would actually run it. I don't know if it will work. Source, vn, where do I have to go? Data, source, vn, bin, activate. And then I'll just run fetch progress, fetch Congress. I'll do fetch FEC. I think that one was better. Yeah, so this is what I was using to cycle. As you notice, that ran very quickly because it didn't have to hit any of the APIs because all the data was saved already. But this just shows, I was just working with the LM on this. I was like, hey, show me like a concise summary of the funding information for individual people. So, for example, Nancy Pelosi, for her 2024 cycle, here's how much she fundraised, here's how much she spent. She fundraised 10 million, cash on hand, PAC money, things like that. 4 million in individual contributions, so you can see that was more in individuals than PACs. But yeah, it shows the top PAC contributions. This literally doesn't make sense if the PAC money is 250K and these guys donated 330. The math isn't mathing on that, but I'll look into that on the next stream. But yeah, then you can see these individuals who donated money, Diane, Harvey, Elizabeth, Stephen, things like that. And there's, yeah, these bigger funds with employers. Again, there's a lot of different like structures for fundraising. So I think it would probably be good for me at some point to just copy paste this into an LLM and say, hey, can you explain how like the hierarchy of fundraising, like how do PACs go into schedules and how do committees fit in that picture? Because that is like understanding the underlying structure of your project for the data is extremely, extremely important. That's not something you want to fully rely on an LLM on, because that's something that you, with the context of what you want your project to look like, will need to be aware of, versus like, oh, the cache utility. You don't ever need to open this. It will be obvious if it fails. It will be obvious if it works. Like the only validation I did was just looking in data and being like, oh, cool, there's files in here. It works. And yeah, so that is running it. Because at this point, I guess just in the broader context of project development, so taking a step out before we wrap up, at this stage, essentially what you want to do is just run the data loading on a smaller subset, see that it makes sense, kind of tinker with it, and get like your final product working with like 3 people. So here's all the fundraising they have, here's how they voted in the past, and then maybe using that to paint together a final picture. And once you, because you're going to be iterating a lot on that, because you'll do something, it won't work, you'll improve it, so on. So you just want to keep your sample size small while you're iterating, and then once you get that full pipeline built out just with those 3 people, then you'll scale it up to all of Congress. You'll be like, okay, cool, I'm done now. Let's do this with all of Congress, run it. And then once that's done, you can build your web app on top of it. You also could build your web app only once you finish with those first 3 test people, if you want to just get started on that first. But if it can plug in with 3 people, you'll make it in a way where it can plug in with all of Congress. So that one's just kind of a personal preference thing. I would argue maybe there is a right decision there. But yeah, that was pretty much what we got done in the first stream. As mentioned, it was not a lot of flashy stuff. It's mostly just here's how you get the data, here's how you think about what needs to be done first, and seeing what is possible to build for kind of a vision of monitoring Congress members based on the information that's available, and a bit of how you set up a project to do that. So yeah, next up on the next stream, we'll be focusing more on the Congress, like looking at the bills they voted on and trying to use an LLM to kind of get a picture of what their stances are in terms of actions rather than words. So like, do they actually reduce military spending? Do they actually increase military spending? Do they do this or that? All these topics. So that's what'll be up next, and I will be recording that one. But again, it is very like sparse in terms of information density because it's 2 hours to get like I'm just writing code, and a lot of times I'm waiting on Claude and things like that. But either way, that upload will be there, and I hope this was helpful to anyone that is building stuff. Again, I know the production value isn't really as high as a lot of other stuff, but I did just want to get this out there for those of you who are building to share some concepts that I use when I'm building. So, cheers.